All right, this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 29, Section 5, Sub-Saharan Africa 1900 to 1945. So one thing that changed with World War I was that Germany's colonies, Germany lost their colonies in Africa. And, generally speaking, these colonies then passed to either, Britain, France, some other nations, etc. And this was, of course, a condition of World War I, and specifically the Treaty of Versailles. That is one thing to take note of, right? That Germany lost their colonies in Africa. Continuing, though, to focus on this period 1900 to 1945, if we look at both the economy and society, one thing to take note of is that when it came to Africa and the era of new imperialism, that for the most part, European settlers did not actually live in Africa. There were a couple of exceptions. So in the case of Algeria and France, Kenya with the British, South Africa with the British and the Dutch, these were some of the few places that had large European settler populations. So in these areas, there were, in fact, a lot of Europeans who lived in these areas. Most of the other colonies had a very small presence of outsiders who mainly held sort of the positions of power. The colonial infrastructure refers to things like, railroads. We might say telegraphs. Right, a lot of the colonial infrastructure was meant to benefit the imperial powers. That is to say that railroads were constructed in a way to export various resources. Most of the ownership belonged in the hands of Europeans, so European companies owned, we might say, much of the, we'll say the imperial economy, because, there certainly is an economy that exists in Africa that doesn't involve Europeans at all. But when it came to certain things like resources, and the resources that European companies and the colonial infrastructure really extracted included a lot of mineral resources. In the case of diamonds in South Africa, gold is another good example. Another resource that was very valuable during the industrial period, rubber, although at this point there are other parts of the globe where rubber is grown, Southeast Asia in particular, but also palm oil. Palm oil was a lubrication for machinery. Here's some of the some people here extracting palm oil there. And again, the resources were meant primarily for export. Now, for the most part, when it came to the labor policies, typically it was believed that by Europeans investing this infrastructure, bringing in outside technology and ideas, that this generally led to an increase in the standard of living. However, a closer look at the effect of the colonial economy reveals that, for the most part, labor policies were mostly detrimental to African population. It was only after the 1930s that really some of the benefits of outside technology really began to improve things like the material standard of living. But, think about all the disruption due to the economy. Think about some of the harsh practices that you would have seen on some of these plantations. Think about the ways in which forced migrations also disrupted the way of life. And maybe not most importantly, but, also let's not forget the types of racial discrimination that was, part of these policies. Racial discrimination was probably the most intense in European settled areas. So it would have been in places like South Africa, which, for the most part had probably the most notorious apartheid and discriminatory laws there. Laws regarding racial discrimination certainly didn't serve the African population. In terms of the politics and culture, Africa is a very big continent. but there are two dominant religions. The first one is Christianity, which was brought by missionaries mostly in the West and the South. Was where Christianity was the most intense. One kind of thing to take note of is Ethiopia. It's an exception. That is a Christian kingdom. And Christianity in Ethiopia predates the age of exploration. Many of these missionaries arriving around the year, 1400 to about 1600, Christian missionaries from Europe. Ethiopia had been a Christian kingdom since like the 600s or something like that. Even before that, right? Before Islam, maybe like the 400s, we might say. So a very, very long and isolated version of Christianity thrived in Ethiopia all the way up until the 1900s. Islam, meanwhile, was also introduced to Africa. In many places, it is older than Christianity. So for example, in East Africa, we talked about the Swahili. Also, to a certain degree, we'll call this the West, or maybe Central/Western Africa, Islam was more popular. In North Africa, Islam tends to be more popular. Egypt, Morocco, Algeria, some places like that. And both of these continue to be very important and powerful influences in the continent. A newer idea introduced, nationalism. Again, nationalism is pride in one's nation. And, one thing that colonialism helped do was to foster, unintentionally, African nationalism. It did a couple of things. One, it created a common foe, right? That would be imperialist powers, but also brought ideas. And this is most clearly the case when you look especially at the various sort of liberal ideas that are brought in. Again, when we think about liberal ideas, maybe ideas related to like the French Revolution and the Enlightenment. We'll say all men being created equal, something that Thomas Jefferson said. And again, these ideas, government by the people, for the people, these were very popular in Europe at the time. And so it's one thing to espouse, to say all men are created equal, but at the same time practice very clear policies of racial discrimination. And it was the inconsistency here. It was the contradiction that gave rise to various voices promoting a type of African nationalism. Probably the one that's most globally recognized is Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism was an idea that flourished not just in Africa, but also in places of the Americas, especially where there were large populations of African descent. The southern United States, well, not just the southern United States, but all the United States. In the Caribbean, which still had large African populations, these were all areas that were greatly impacted by the African diaspora meaning mass migration or mass movement of people. And Pan-Africanism was the idea that all African people, again, in Africa and the New World, kind of unite together, to form one nation. And that is to put aside kind of traditional ideas of identity like religion. So it's not a matter of whether you're Christian or Islam, kin group, which is family, or, clan or tribal identity, to kind of get rid of these identifiers and instead unite around this idea of purely Africanism. W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey, these were both supporters of Pan-Africanism. They both, actually, Du Bois was in the U.S., Garvey was in the Caribbean. Garvey, I think Jamaica, maybe. I may get that island wrong. And the organization, the African National Congress in 1912, created to promote African nationalism. For the most part, between the years 1900 and 1945, there wasn't really a lot of, maybe results that you could put your finger on in terms of nationalist movements. There were some very important people speaking out against it. There was certainly under the surface, ideas of nationalism being fostered by this contradiction. But the Congress, which was created, it was really after 1945 that becomes important. We'll talk about this in a later chapter, but after 1945, you get the process of decolonization, and that's really when nationalism in Africa really begins to flourish. But the ideas are there, right? The ideas and the movements are kind of being created. In terms of new media technology, for the most part, both the radio and the cinema were very limited. The cinema, for example, or movies, were almost non-existent, right? We'll just say limited. And the radio, if when radios did exist in Africa, they were mostly in European languages. So there are very few radios that were in African languages that could be understood by the masses. Instead, they were in these languages that would suit the white settler populations in places like Kenya or South Africa.